I'm very glad to be here and honored to chair the first session of the Poletayev Institute. I will try not to take on too much time and will just briefly introduce all of our presenters. As you know, the format of our conference is that we have two conceptualization presentations and then several discussions. So I'm very happy to introduce Michael Gordin, a professor in Princeton University, but also a fellow in our Poletayev Institute. Marina Mogilner from University of Illinois at Chicago, who is also a great friend of our institute. And as discussants, we have four people: Olga Bessmertnaya, our colleague from High School of Economics, Rossen and Djagalov from New York University, Andrey Mozhajsky from Institute for Oriental and Classical Studies at Higher School of Economics, and Ovchinnikov from Tomsk State University. So our geography for this session is very diverse and broad, as you can see. Just to remind you, Alexei set us a very strict time frame. So every presenter with the conceptualization presentations have 15 to 20 minutes. And then every discussant has 5 to 7 minutes. And then we'll open floor to a general open discussion and everyone can contribute, if we have enough time, of course. So I open the floor to Michael Gordin. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Daria. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Marina Maximovna. Thank you all of you for coming to this very unusual event, but an event I'm delighted to be part of. I'll dive right in. I hopefully will take less than 15 minutes, so we have more time for discussion. As was pointed out, I was asked to provide a statement about what theoretical changes have happened in my own field, which is the history of science, a subset of the history of knowledge, in the 21st century. And Alex put it very specifically that he wanted me to talk about something that was irreversible, in the sense that a change has happened that I think can't be undone. So I wrote a brief think piece about what I think the major theoretical change has been, focusing on the history of science. Marina Mogilner kindly and very thoughtfully reacted to it. I'm going to briefly summarize my thoughts and then continue some of the discussion with her. I had three main points, and I think they're organized roughly in order of importance. The first is a general point for the whole conference that resonates with what Galin Tihanov has said in his own statement, which is that we have a very particular and I think fairly narrow conceptualization of what counts as theory. If you take a work that unambiguously is theory, and then you look at its footnotes, real or implied, and then look at those works and look at what sources it drew from, and you keep going back, you'll basically stop at Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, something like that. There's a very small set of usually Central European thinkers where things stop, sometimes Descartes. So most of that is a Western European discourse. There's a partial exception with Bakhtin, which we could talk about, or alternative sources of theory that may not draw directly on that tradition. But I think that this narrow conceptualization is even true for postcolonial theory, as Marina Mogilner points out. I mean, the footnotes, and I say this in the statement, there go back to Gramsci, to Foucault, who in themselves draw on Nietzsche and Marx. So there is, again, a very narrow conception of what theory is. I don't want this point to get lost, because I think a good format for specifically IGITI as a group to discuss is what we think theory is, what it is for, where it comes from, and what the limitations of it can be in excluding other ways of thinking about material. So it's not to say that one should stop doing theory, but perhaps expand the category of what counts. And I don't think postcolonial theory does that expansion. I think it is part of the same theoretical frame. The second point, most of the frameworks in the history of science and the history of knowledge are really very much 20th century. There have been, I think, very few major ruptures that have happened in the 21st century. People still go back to questions that were posed by Wittgenstein, Fleck, Kuhn, Latour, and especially Latour's early work in the 1980s, over and over again. But my job was to point out what is new within this field. And what is new is, I think, an attention to postcolonial theory. I share many of Marina's reservations about the implications of postcolonial theory. I'm not advocating it. I am, however, pointing out an empirical reality, which is that it has taken a place in the history of knowledge that I think is not able to be dislodged. It can be worked with and possibly worked against, but it is part of the conversation in a way I think it was not 20 years ago. In the history of knowledge, it was part of the conversation of the history of empires and the history of labor much earlier than that. I'm not primarily interested in what it means for imperial and colonial history, although I think it's a fascinating discussion. And again, I think Marina is largely right. But I'm interested in how historians of science have appropriated it and taken it as a category of their own. And that's the change that seems to me to be permanent. So point 3 is about unmarked categories. There have been, since there has been history of knowledge, there has been a distinct attention to questions of the role of women, of anonymous laborers, etc., within those fields, but they have been treated as a kind of separate category, that one should study the history of knowledge and also the history of women thinkers as a kind of subfield. That, I think, is no longer the frame that's happened, and I think it's come from a particular interpretation and adaptation of postcolonial theory, which is to question which categories we assume are natural and which ones are unmarked. When you ask students to draw a scientist, which I do on a regular basis, they almost always draw a white man. That's just the way they draw that picture. That's not actually a good picture of scientists. Most scientists are not white men. It's a subset of that. Most scientists and engineers are a much more global group than that. But nonetheless, the unmarked category, the category that people think of as the normal, has been produced in a certain way. And I believe postcolonial theory is the way in which there are many theoretical strands that could have questioned this point of view, but the way that it came into history of science is through first attention to what happens to knowledge in British India and French North Africa and French Indochina and Chinese treaty port cities. And then from there came to reshape how people talked about science in Paris and Berlin and Moscow and New York. So this, I think, is a specific issue for the history of science because of science's highly privileged place as a form of knowledge. So what counts as marked and unmarked knowledge? The knowledge that you assume is normal and the knowledge that you think is deviant or alternative is an extremely charged one. And the goal has generally been to expand the canon outside of Europeans and outside of men and outside of white men in particular. So that's the place where I started. Marina has a lot to say about the limitations of postcolonial theory. And again, I largely agree. I'm not endorsing this because I think some of the advantages of postcolonial theory can come from alternative modernities or different reformulations of other strands of theory. I do not think that is empirically the strand that has produced this rethinking within the field of the history of knowledge. And perhaps that's a defect. Had we taken a different path, the questions would be more sharp and we would have avoided certain problems that currently exist. I'm neutral on that question. I think, for example, the reactivation of nationalism, which is a great point, I do not see being a result of this attention to category marking. It is, however, something that you do see in those post-colonial historians of science who are interested in recovering a tradition that they think has been sidelined. I do want to say, and this is my last point, but it's longer, something about Marina's very sharp critique about my far too quick statement about organically grown theories. I think she's right here. I was clearly too fast about this, and her critique is correct. Some organic theories are disturbing or not necessarily ones we would like to endorse. Eurasianism is a very good example of that. But I don't think that implies that all organic theories are necessarily disruptive this way. They all have a problematic relationship with authenticity, but that's not always fatal. It could be sometimes averted. I don't think it implies that for the same reason that fascism does not invalidate all the Western thought that it draws on, which are the same sources of Western thought that most theory draws on too. Hegel and so on. My point is more empirical than about authenticity. So, and again, I keep retreating to, you may call it retreating to the empirical or transcending to the empirical. Instead of trying to construct our analytics from first principles, from theoretical presuppositions and axioms, which is, I think, the position that much theoretical work draws on. Latour is a very good example of this, of someone who starts from first principles and tries to expand out a way of understanding knowledge in nature, and the fact that there isn't a good distinction between nature and knowledge. I think we can observe solutions to the problem of knowledge and the problem of power that are being implemented in many different contexts, not just in the non-West or the third world or whatever category, the global South, whatever you would call, but also in unaccustomed places, in normal places, like how a hacker space in Moscow is treating some of the problems of knowledge and power. That's not a post-colonial context, but it is a context in which the categories of assumed power, privilege, and access to knowledge have shifted. And the same would be true with many do-it-yourself biotech movements, environmental protest movements, etc. These groups do not have a privileged access to the authentic, real, true at all, but they are challenging the other established forms which also do not have a privileged access to the true, the real, etc. And I think that it might be useful to experiment with observing some of these solutions in practice and see if there are theoretical principles that we can derive from them that are not from the same chain of footnotes that I am worried about at the beginning. So those are my brief introductory comments. I'm more interested to hear the discussion because I will learn something new, which is the purpose of these readings. So thank you very much. I think I am in time, and I will keep to Daria's very rigorous schedule.
Yes, thank you. You are ahead of time, actually. And Marina, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the organizers. I have to be honest, I'm so glad to see so many familiar faces. So welcome everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. And also thank you to Michael. I know I was in a kind of a more privileged position because I was basically asked to comment on, Michael's text, and this gave me opportunities to be maybe more critical, to engage with Michael's ideas. But I do agree with many of the responses that and explanations and clarifications that Michael offered today, and especially the last point where he expanded on his understanding of authenticity, and definitely, the message that this kind of approach allows to reconsider and overcome existing hierarchies, right, based on this idea of norm and access. I absolutely agree with that. I also have to point out that I'm coming from a different perspective. I am a historian of empires and knowledge production in imperial context. And definitely you can see how our view of the situation differs, and even understanding of what theory is may differ. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to summarize my response to Michael, just to maybe help those who didn't have time to read our text to figure out the most essential points of our conversation, agreements and disagreements. And then I'm very interested in learning from the discussants. So as I said, I structured my presentation as a response to Michael, and I think we agree that the greatest contribution of the post-colonial tone has been this epistemological critique of norm, of what I understand the critique of the analytical languages of human and social sciences that we deem as neutral, as objective, and as universal, and the critique that allows us to expose structures of epistemological domination, and most importantly, the embeddedness of our analytical language, our theories, our ideas of norm in specific mental geographies, gender and race regimes, and so on. And I interpreted this as, including Michael's questioning unmarked categories through explicating the process by which they came to be unmarked. And I propose that if this is so, then we probably can apply the same questioning, the same approach to the very opposition of West to non-West in postcolonial theory. And then I remind about kind of a common knowledge nowadays that the argument that modern theoretical language is an instrument of negation or colonization or marginalization of the non-West goes together with the pessimistic assertion that subalterns can't speak, and this is so because of the all-pervasive nature of Western modernity, of Western theory, of Western capitalism, which basically coincides with modernity in self. And Chakrabarty in particular is very clear on this point. Non-Western theory is impossible. And this leads me to my next point, that exposing the power of Western episteme to produce unmarkedness is not enough for an independent epistemological order to emerge. And this was the problem that postcolonial theory recognized, and the answer to this challenge was that we have to look into spaces of authenticity, spaces that have been spared from otherwise total power of Western episteme, where kind of authentic, organic forms of knowledge survived and developed. So, and I think that we can hear allusions here to the discourse of Michael's call for theory from elsewhere. And, Michael actually explained what he meant today, and this may be really something different from what I'm working with in my response. I read Michael's initial statement as being not about kind of experimental and more specific forms of knowledge, but really about looking for an authentic episteme, a language of science, a kind of normative order that would be opposed to, this powerful Western language of science and epistemic domination. And since I read this way, so my reaction to this was that we know, again, from the experience of postcolonial turn, that having equipped us with the essential tools of deconstruction, of epistemological deconstruction, this turn still has left us with the discourse authenticity as the only real alternative. So it's either post-colonial, it's either colonial muteness or some post-colonial authenticity, which always results in a kind of a nationalizing narrative, nationalizing science, nationalizing authentic ideas about subaltern forms of knowledge. And we know very well from contemporary body of scholarship that this discourse that claims authenticity often appears as a tradition constructed with the help of Western epistemes of ethnography, anthropology, musicology, and so on. And again, I'm speaking here as a historian, as someone who knows humanities and social sciences much better than hard sciences, right? So And I brought this example with Russian Eurasianism as a kind of a classical example of authentic knowledge that was for theories that was formulated as a critique of Western colonialism. An early critique of Western colonialism was very explicit in the sense that, attempted to offer an authentic language of Eurasian hybridity, of nationalizing view of Russianness as embedded in the hybrid Eurasian natural and cultural landscapes. But then it gave rise to, scientific scholarly theories, structural geography, language, phonology, that then moved at the center of what we call Western science and Western theorizing. So my question would be here, so can we is Russian Eurasianism an example of a theory from some authentic national elsewhere, or an invitation to destabilize the very notion of Western modernity as it had been affirmed by the postcolonial turn that operates with binary visions and binary categories rather than, a more complex, I think, models that have been developed in critique of anti-colonial theory from the perspective, and Michael mentioned this also in his presentation today, from the perspective of empire studies and also, I think, cultural studies as well. And then I discuss the view of modernity as a global project based, grounded in complex imperial globality, which was hierarchical, which definitely was unevenly constructed and allowed Western theorists and politicians and scientists to claim Western modernity for the West, but this is also a historical process. I mean, the moment when this global process of an exchange and interaction had been claimed by Western modernity can be traced historically, and I also refer to works that, such as El-Shahri's study, Reading Darwin in Arabic, and others that point to very active and conscious engagement of non-Western scholars with, this Western normative knowledge, specifically during the moment when this knowledge had been claimed as exclusively Western. So basically, from here, I come to my final conclusion that probably we don't have to follow the post-colonial turn to the very end. And probably we don't have to embrace this authenticity that grows organically out of the phenomenon itself. I'm quoting from Michael's paper, that maybe it's more productive to use Western theories with an appreciation of their embeddedness in a global context of exchange and exploitation and mutual translations, and basically everything that we usually ascribe to these imperial formations. It's productive to read Foucault through Anne Stoller's eyes and question where there is race and how it's coded in his theory. It's productive to read Fanon as a contributor to Western theory and Western knowledge. And I think that globalizing Western modernity can offer a better framework for reassembling the pieces of deconstructed epistemologies than authentic spaces from elsewhere can. So thank you, and I stop here.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Marina, for very concise, very short introductions. We have left quite a lot of time to our discussants, and we continue with Olga Bessmertnaya's talk. Olga, please.
Hi. So I have to confess that I read the papers very much in Marina's way. And I second Marina's critique of the so-called discourse of authenticity, as well as her critique of the sharp post-colonial binaries between West and Rest. Hence, I join her argument about a global Western theory, so to say, is more productive for us to use than some organically grown frameworks, as Michael has put it in his paper. I would even go further and suggest that we hardly have any other choice besides the global Western theory. Yet I have somewhat different grounds for this position. First of all, what exactly are we speaking about? Is it a history of the production of knowledge and science and theory in particular? Or is it a discussion, as may follow from Michael's presentation, of how theory actually functions and how we should construct and apply it? I think we should discuss these two aspects one by one. And I have 3 points. First, both speakers, Michael and Marina, if I got them correctly, are actually inscribing studying theory into a broader context of today's historical studies, the approaches which sometimes deem themselves postcolonial beyond the subaltern group, and sometimes don't. And they are more or less related to globalizing history. It's an array of approaches attentive to all kinds of human diversity and connectivity, to the invented character and porousness of cultural and symbolic borders, to circulation of ideas and the role in it of different kinds of cultural intermediaries and go-betweens. That is the approaches who name themselves either relational histories or connected histories or entangled histories or histoire croisée, etc. This is quite relevant to the history of knowledge production and the acknowledgement of its polycentric nature and its multiple sources, which Marina spoke about. Point 2. The idea of global modernity, which Marina refers to, is indeed quite important here. I fully support this shift to a kind of new universalism, studying global processes with full awareness of their embeddedness into social, cultural, and political hierarchies. It's a step aside from the concepts of multiple modernities, justly criticized, in particular by Sebastian Conrad, whom Marina follows, for their civilizational character. Muslims in Russia in the late 19th century also read Darwin, as their counterparts in the Arabic world did, and responded to Renan, who contested the capability of the Muslim world of science and hence of progress and history. I mean his notorious lecture, Islamisme et la science. I'm not sure if they read them in Arabic, but they did in Russian with their own voices. But modernity, besides offering vivid examples of the entangled histories of the production of knowledge, entangled because we observe here the circulation of ideas in different, often opposite directions, not only from the West to Muslims, but vice versa too. And besides showing the importance of the shared idea of science as manifestation of progress and historical future, also shows limitations for such an entanglement. I mean the difference of discourses which are used by different parts in this process. Beyond the ideas as such, it involves, for example, the inherited procedures of proving or different ways of structuring history, etc. To the extent that one may observe a kind of discursive cultural multilingualism in one and the same work. For example, a Muslim author proves the openness of the Muslim world to science and progress by providing an appropriate hadith. Such cultural multilingualism is an important feature in the history of knowledge production, but it seems an obstacle for science to function. Science and theory in particular needs a shared, commonly understandable and accepted language to describe and structure phenomena in question. We can't just combine them. A framework grown organically out of the phenomena itself, as Michael has put it in his paper, will, I'm afraid, speak to itself and nobody else. We need to translate it in a Western language, even if influenced by global processes. Scholars who applied Jakobson's structuralism were hardly interested in its Eurasian origins. Of course, the formation of such a shared language is a subject for an entangled history of science, but not its practicing. But why then, and this is my final point, questions like who has done it and where does theory come from matter at all? Would it be more productive having a shared scientific language at hand? Better stop asking them to return to a kind of disembodied and universal thinking which Galin Tikhanov, who will speak in the next session, mentioned as gone away in his paper. I put this question as a provocation. Of course, these questions do matter for us to understand the processes of the formation of science and theory, and especially to see where our theory is embedded into, what social, cultural, and political hierarchies it implies. But may it be so that while applying it, we may allow ourselves to pretend to be to some extent blind, so as not to become quite mute under pressure of its embeddedness. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Olga. And next is Rossen Djagalov, please.
Thank you, and I really thank you for the invitation. I really miss IGITI, and I'm so happy to see so many colleagues, even if only on Zoom. So I apologize if I'll be reading my comments, but otherwise I'll run out of time badly. So Thomas Mann had this essay, Dostoevsky in Moderation. So if I can summarize the thrust of my comments, it would be post-colonialism, but in moderation. Like Professors Mogilner and Bessmertnaya, I will focus on the limitations of post-colonialism, but will do so from a somewhat different position, that of Marxism. So in this spirit, and following Frederick Jameson's imperative, always historicize, let me start by situating the post-colonial turn in relation to the fortunes of Marxism in the 20th century. For when post-colonialism emerged, first as a distinct body of thought and subsequent in the 80s and subsequently as a discipline in the 90s, it took the place of theorizing difference and inequality between societies previously occupied by Marxist thought. It performed some of the same intellectual labor that Marxism had been doing since the beginning of the 20th century, when the Second International was the epicenter of anti-colonial thought. In the interwar period, this epicenter shifted to the Comintern, which hosted events such as the Baku Congress of the Peoples of the East. In 1920s, institutions such as the Communist University for Toilers of the East and movements such as the League Against Imperialism. The onset of Stalinism and the Second World War interrupted this tradition, but even the 1955 Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung and the Third World Project that emanated from it were heavily informed by Marxist analysis of how to decolonize, how to break the dependence on the West, how to develop a new national economy, society, culture. So when 1990 came about and the state that had once seemed to embody Marxism internationally disappeared from the maps, and so did the Third World, already weakened and in so many ways predicated on the Cold War. In this one world of uncontested Western hegemony, post-colonialism came to fill in the void, at least in the academy, without maybe the threat that Marxism had once posed, without the living connections to social movements that had made Marxism so powerful. So as a method of analysis, post-colonial theory produces brilliant readings and critique, but the emancipatory mantle it sometimes puts on doesn't always suit it. So here's my second point, closer to the topic, that ever since its Orientalism, post-colonial thought's signature intervention had been in the critique of universalities, which are so often shown to be deeply Western, provincial, or even worse, facilitating the work of colonialism. Much of that work is the study of unmarked categories with which Professor Gordin opened the panel, has been extremely productive. But the more radical forms of this critique of universalism, especially in the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty and Partha Chatterjee, as well as the absolutization of difference between East and West, not only questions the existence of a communality among people living on this planet, and whether we call that communality human rights, common humanity, or solidarity, it doesn't matter, but also problematically shares the central assumption of any imperialist or racist, namely that the people of the East are fundamentally different from the people of the West. One particular target, especially in the work of Chakrabarty and Chatterjee, are precisely Marxism's universal pretensions. Marxism, in their account, emerges as just another body of Eurocentric thought. And yet, many of the most innovative interventions in 20th century Marxism, from Lenin and Trotsky to Maritegui in Latin America, Mao in China, Fanon in Northern, and Amilcar Cabral in Sub-Saharan Africa, emerged as efforts to revise Marxism in the light of the immense differences of the societies they were living in from classical Western ones, on the basis of which that theory had been originally written. But it is not only Marxism that has been on the receiving end. It's worth pointing out that the paradox that though postcolonial theory has emerged as the greatest thought of theoretical innovations within many fields, as Professor Gordin illustrated with the history of science, it has at the same time been a powerful inhibitor to the universalizing impulse of other theories. And this a source of much of the resistance of theory that will be the subject of the next panel. And finally, if I have a couple more minutes, let me address again from a Marxist point of view the tendency of postcolonial studies to privilege the realm of the discursive and epistemological over the material. It is the reading of literary and cultural texts, this approach does have some utility, but as a transdisciplinary super method, it leads to the problematic belief that the problem is in our heads rather than in the material realities around us. And if we get our heads in order, if we get rid of the Eurocentrism and the discursive framework and its discursive frameworks, then the material realities around us will change accordingly. And one does not need to be a Marxist to wonder about that. To illustrate the limitations of this approach, let me end with the examination of the post-Soviet situation, where the post-colonial turn in the history of knowledge is taking place simultaneously with the disappearance of most material vestiges of actual post-colonial cultures in contemporary Russia. 1990, according to James Mark, represented not so much Eastern Europe's joining the West, but rather the severing of its social, economic, and cultural connections to the global South, and thus its provincializations. There are no Indian films to be screened on Russian cinemas any longer, no African books being translated and sold in Moscow bookstores. If you go to the Institute of Oriental Studies in the Department of Literature of the East, where I spent some time, you witness the expertise of the disappearance of expertise of many countries and cultures. The number of languages that are simply no longer taught in Russia. One does not even need to go that far in space. It suffices to note the disappearance of former Soviet literatures, cultures, and histories from the purview of contemporary Russian academy, even in the truncated and ideologically questionable format of literatures of the peoples of the Soviet Union, in which they were once taught. So there is a certain shallowness in a post-colonial turn without post-colonial cultures. And that brings me to an end.
Thank you. Andrey Mozhajsky.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here, and I will speak about some specific area of research. I mean archaeological theory and post-colonial age in relation to our key speakers' claims. And maybe as far as I see now, maybe we have some common views on the matter. Ideas and trends that remained relevant to archaeological thinking today can be traced back to the European Enlightenment of the 70th and 18th centuries, with its epicenter in France, but possessing important local foci in Germany and Britain. Russia adopted this advanced Germanic version in the course of the 19th century. So my observation of the beginning of archaeological theory is in agreement with Professor Gordin's first broad claim. We have defined archaeological theory in a geographically restricted manner. The development of Western archaeological theory has been extensively studied and developed by such well-known researchers as Colin Renfrew, John Bintley, Michael Shanks, and others. I have named only those who are related to the field of classical studies. As for development in the post-colonial era, Western archaeological theory had great impulse in the late 1960s and 1970s, when some advanced scholars formulated new archaeology or processual archaeology. Systems theory became a dominant model in processual views of the past. In this, societies are seen as a series of subsystems interacting with each other and the environment in which the systems is set. But even since the mid-1970s, processual archaeology has come under criticism from several quarters. For example, it was criticized by Ken Flannery, who was scornful of the trivial nature of some of the so-called laws proposed and felt that more attention should be focused on the ideological and symbolic aspects of societies. Ian Hodder likewise felt that archaeology's closest links were with history and wanted to see the role of the individual in history more fully recognized. Out of this criticism, some scholars have tried to formulate new approaches, the so-called post-processual archaeology. Among the influences contributing to post-processual are neo-Marxism, Althusser, Balibar, Lukács, the post-positivist view advocated by Feyerabend, the structuralism of Claude Lévi-Strauss, critical theory and Frankfurt School, the post-structuralism of Foucault and Derrida, feminist approaches, and others. Actually, post-processualism is not united theory. It is different approaches, and post-colonial turn also affected the theory. Let me give you example from classical studies, both history and archaeology. Edward Said in Orientalism, 1978, has made a case against the ideology and meta-narrative of Orientalism. Orientalism defines the East as a foil of the superiority of the West, proposing that the East consists of incompletely developed cultures, despotic or degenerate, defining what Europe is not. At this point, let me introduce the ideas of Martin Bernal and his book Black Athena, which was published in 3 volumes from 1980s to 2000s. And consider Bernal's argument, ancient Greece owed much of the East to Egypt and Phoenicia, in the Levant particularly, conduits for ideas and materials from the great Eastern empires. This has long been accepted, but Bernal proposes conquests, political domination, and colonization of Greece by Oriental powers in the 2nd millennium BC. Ancient Greece developed under direct and considerable influence from the East. For Bernal, Egypt was black, Phoenicians were Semitic. If ancient Greece is conceived as the fount of European civilization, then that civilization is black and Semitic in origin. For Bernal, 19th century scholarship denied the Afro-Asiatic and Semitic roots of Greek culture because of racism and anti-Semitism. I should also say that many academics denied Black Athena. Oswin Murray, author of the standard text on early Greece, makes a point of distancing himself from what he calls Bernal's fantasies. The debate continues to this day. I would like also to turn your attention to Turkey. There are many archaeological projects in Turkey that work with classical or Byzantine monuments. Turkish researchers use Western methods of archaeological research and have joint projects. But at a higher level of civilizational interpretation, 1453 year, the fall of Constantinople occurred for the Western world, but for the East, it is the capture of Istanbul. So it goes hand by hand with the history of empires, which is the sphere of the study of Professor Mogilner. So postcolonial turn really affected such a traditional scope of discipline as classical studies. Also, the instruments and methods of the research everywhere are still Western. And the last, as I said, Western archaeological theory has many directions, and sometimes even Anglo-Saxon direction does not use the achievement of the German school, as it is in the case with German Antiquarian scholarship in classical studies. So in my opinion, Western archaeological theory has its own tensions, not to mention postcolonial turn. And maybe I suppose that really theory is Western in its origin. And about the question of Professor Mogilner, I think that it is more productive to use Western theory as a language of research. And we can fill it with different traditional material, but the language of research, of argumentation, should be Western, I suppose. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And finally, Alexander Ovchinnikov.
Уважаемые коллеги, большое спасибо за предоставленное слово. Я думаю, не очень сильно огорчу организаторов, если позволю себе высказать мысли на русском языке, потому что мой уровень владения английским не позволяет пока строить еще очень сложных предложений. И я думаю, что отнесутся ко мне коллеги снисходительно. Действительно, тема, которая была поднята в предыдущих выступлениях, она очень актуальна. Действительно, возможно ли за пределами незападной науки создание адекватной теории, которая бы отражала, не то чтобы отражала реальность, по крайней мере, соответствовала логике, каким-то логическим законам. Ну, здесь прежде всего следует сказать, что теория, на мой взгляд, нужна не столько для академического сообщества, сколько для общества. Благодаря теориям общество и академическое сообщество налаживают коммуникации друг с другом. И если теория, то есть какой-то обобщенный корпус знаний не соответствует ожиданиям общества, то эта теория, она в принципе не нужна. Как показывает материал российских региональных историй, они заточены на какой-то очередной мобилизационный проект, то есть имеется в виду прежде всего этнонациональные истории. И если академическое сообщество местное попытается выйти за рамки вот тех императивов, которые предложены свыше, которые общество ожидает, окажется, что теория другая, какая бы логичная она ни была, она не будет нужна людям. И поэтому...
Александр, извините, если вы хотите, я могу попробовать вас переводить очень примерно.
Хорошо.
Okay, I'll try to translate, Alexander, but I'm not an interpreter. I'm very sorry in advance, so I'll try to maybe sum up. So Alexander started by saying that it's a very interesting topic about the interrelation of Western and non-Western theory. And he wants to approach this topic from a bit of a different perspective, from a perspective of Russian regional theories. And he wants to also underline that theories are often used not just by us scholars, but also are very important for the societies themselves. And in case of Russian regional Russian regional scholarship, for instance, it is very notable that the theories that are produced are sort of ethno-national theories. And if there are other theories produced, they are not of much interest to the local societies. Alexander?
И в таких нарративах, я имею в виду этнонациональной истории, наблюдается очень интересная закономерность. Чем ближе к методологическому ядру данных повествований, то тем больше каких-то мифических элементов, тем все проще и иррациональнее. Чем дальше от методологического ядра, чем ближе к, собственно, эмпирическим исследованиям, то если говорить в позитивистском дискурсе, больше научности, очень детальные эмпирические исследования, и, на мой взгляд, можно говорить о своеобразном мировом разделении труда. Что касается условно территорий, которых можно назвать незападными, для социальной реальности этих территорий все-таки характерно больше эмпирические исследования, тогда как обобщение этих эмпирических исследований неплохо было бы, собственно говоря, предоставить тем сообществам, которые более свободны в выражении своих мыслей, которые менее зависимы от окружающего поля, от каких-то ненаучных факторов.
So what we see in the local national histories in Russia is that if the studies produced are sort of less methodologically strict, they are closer to some mythologizing. They are much simpler. And on the other hand, if there are less myths and they're more methodologically rigorous, they are very complex. There are a lot of scientific lingua. So there is, what Alexander tries to say is that probably should be some sort of global division of labor where these sort of local historians work with very particular studies and very particular histories, and those scholars who are less framed, who are less influenced by their structures, by their communities, who have more freedom, they can make generalizations on the basis of the specific studies. Alexander?
Спасибо. Для посттрадиционного мышления характерно невнимание к логическим противоречиям. Социальные психологи называют такой тип мышления холистическим. И если мы обратимся к конкретным нарративам тех же самых российской общефедеральной истории, российских региональных историй, то мы увидим определенные нарушения логики, но эти нарушения логики, они связаны с различными ненаучными факторами. А даже если используется какая-то теория, очередная новомодная теория, которая взята в кавычках с Запада, то она превращается в какое-то такое престижное орудие для подтверждения тех истин, которые кажутся само собой разумеющимися и которые нужны в данной политической обстановке.
This holistic approach that doesn't see some disengagement within theories, and for instance, if we look on the federal or regional scale of Russian history, we see that it is mostly influenced not by scientific academic factors, but mostly by non-scientific political ones. And they just try to create studies that align with these political agendas. And even if in such studies, some new and fashionable, often Western theory is applied, it is applied more as a fancy tool to still ground the findings that are dictated by the political agenda. Alexander.
определенное напряжение вызывает место соприкосновения двух рациональностей. То есть, когда в кавычках туземная или провинциальная наука существует сама по себе, когда она варится в собственном соку, в принципе, кажется и самим производителям продукта и потребителям, что данный нарратив объясняет и прошлое, и настоящее. Когда же появляются попытки деконструирования этого нарратива, при помощи, ну, назовем это очень условно, западной рациональности, то буквально рушится окружающий мир, рушится прошлое и настоящее. Это вызывает определенные напряжения. И, в принципе, когда вот эти две рациональности, в кавычках, западные, и то, что можно назвать восточной, существуют сами по себе, это способствует, скажем так, более-менее нормальному сосуществованию. Пожалуйста.
Yes, some sort of scholars, science, it creates this narrative that seemingly explains both the past and the present, and because it is sort of so encapsulated, insulated, and doesn't really correspond to the world outside it. So whenever it is deconstructed by some Western theories, it leads to a complete collapse of this whole world that was created, constructed by these theories, both sort of the past and the present. Alexander.
И таким образом я предлагаю не менторское руководство со стороны западной науки, науками, скажем так, туземными, провинциальными и так далее, а я предлагаю мирное сосуществование, использование преимуществ каждого вида рациональности, то есть местная наука, не западная, производит какой-то эмпирический материал, эмпирические исследования. Да, теории пусть будут местные, они соответствуют социальным ожиданиям окружения, они соответствуют политической реальностью, а то, что мы называем западной наукой, западной рациональностью, она это деконструирует и использует в своих интересах, то есть тоже, скажем так, варится в своем соку. И как можно меньше точек соприкосновения, которые ведут к конфликтной ситуации. Вот у меня все, спасибо.
So Alexander suggests a way out of this conundrum. What he suggests is that the way Western and Eastern studies should interact is not by Western studies being some sort of a mentor of this Eastern regional studies, but this peaceful coexistence where we understand that there are two types of rationality in the studies, and this Eastern studies are mostly empirically based and sort of just gather cases and descriptions about different phenomena, and they can create their own theories, but these are local theories that respond to local demands of local communities, but also to political agendas and political problems, whereas Western study can deconstruct that Eastern theories and use them in their agenda, but the idea is that they should not clash, because their clashes lead to this complete collapse of Eastern worlds constructed. And it is really a good thing in this way. And Alexander suggested that Western and Eastern studies just sort of coexist in two parallel realities. Thank you, Alexander. I hope I didn't I didn't deconstruct your presentation and reconstruct it completely differently. I hope it was understandable. I think we're out of discussants. This is great. So we have around 1 hour for discussion. And sure, okay. So Alexandra asks Alexander Ovchinnikov. She writes, what you're saying about is this colonial approach to the provincial science that are needed to Western scholars only for data, and not for interpretation, so not for the study itself. And Alexander replies that the huge empirical material identifies that the theory outside of West is very irrational and very weak. While others are forming their questions, I think I think maybe Marina and Michael want to say something or to add something.
I can go first, unless Marina wants. I think I'll say 4 things. The first is, if the room wants to discuss empire building and postcolonialism in that context, I am delighted to learn from what people will say. Olga and Marina raised a number of extremely good points, and it's not my specialty. So I would love to learn more from the room, but that's not what I would comment on. The second point is, I appreciate this idea that we can use a global modernity framework in order to discuss what happens, to integrate stories from around the world into larger narratives. I think in principle, that is correct. In practice, I don't see that. And let me just say an example from the history of Russian and Soviet science, which I specialize in, which is there is a flourishing right now of the history of Cold War science. A good example of that is a history of the space program. It's never been quite as robust as it has been before. 0 of the people who are graduate students or young professors in this area have bothered to learn Russian, even though it is the largest space program and the most expansive and with the greatest amount of literature in Russian to be used. And part of this is that the way, especially in the science narrative, is seen is so strongly teleological and so strongly monolithic that even people who are working on the Cold War forget that there was a Cold War with, I'm now back. Forget that there was a Cold War with multiple sides in it, which had multiple languages in it. And so there's a de-investment in learning the skill set required to actually produce these global languages. Very few graduate students very few people are entering the field of the history of Russian and Soviet science. The field is much smaller than it was 30 years ago. And those who, there are very few people who do not have heritage speaking capacities who bother to begin. And I think this is an extremely unproductive and negative development that is partially produced by this reliance on an overall universal narrative and not having to pay attention to the details. So I have to work extremely hard to persuade people that the history of Russian science is actually immensely important for their ability to understand the history of British and American science. So my comments come out of a frustration that the integrated picture that you have been advocating and that I agree with isn't in practice happening. And so that's how I would like to be read, is a way of trying to point to people, to argue for a greater investment in thinking about things outside of a particular highly Western-centric framework, even if that framework is just theoretical, because it tends to flatten out other things. The third point is actually linguistic, and the metaphor of language has been used by almost everyone about having a unified language, or in the case of Alexander, having kind of coexistent languages which are translated between. I might be the only person on this phone call who benefits so overwhelmingly from the concession towards English. I'm perfectly happy to have this conversation in Russian. I would be much less articulate if we did so. But this kind of flattening of language strikes me as being, for me, ethically problematic. And I think that's true also theoretically when we translate all these other traditions into a dominant set of traditions in which we work. I don't have a solution to the fragmentation of postcolonial theory and the fact that it, as Rossen points out, is very good at breaking things apart, but not very good at building things back together, or even actively inhibits the ability to build things back together from other theories. I think that point, like Marina's and Olga's points, are very valid. But I worry about the flattening of language because I think it is potentially destructive of new ideas generally. And that's happening on a non-metaphorical linguistic level with the reliance on global English, which I've written about a great deal earlier, but also theoretically. And final point, very small, this is largely in response to Rossen, is I think the universalism in history of science, even within the history of knowledge of the natural sciences, is so overwhelming that the damage that post-colonial science might do in picking apart the narrative is a very low risk. And there is a strong benefit that maybe we can expand the story to include many of these other narratives in a more global framework that Marina, for example, points to us towards without risk of all of these other points. My final coda is I really wish I hadn't used the word organic because it's not what I mean, but it is a word that everybody rightly is pointing out is the problem. So next time I won't. Thank you all very much. I will be silent now.
Thank you. Marina?
Thank you all for very rich comments. And I'm tempted to address almost every comment, but I'll try to limit myself to what I really believe is very key for this discussion. The theme about Western domination, linguistic domination, silencing of entire scientific communities, I absolutely agree. And I think that Olga in her commentary was also right to point out how local context and multilingualism and this constant translation that is going on actually is the mechanism of producing this new reality that is universal, but at the same time context specific. And I think this is also the source of, for new theories to emerge from this very complex constellation of universal and local context and multilingualism and translation and local challenges. And when I say globalizing modernity, I don't imply some wonderful global world where all flowers can blossom and everything. No, I actually very consciously saying imperial modernity as the kind of global modernity that is written with inequalities and power relations and contradictions. And to your, Michael, observation about students of sciences being disinterested in learning Russian, I can share my knowledge about Lithuania, recently part of the Soviet Union and Russian-speaking world, and historians complaining that the new generation of historians are not interested in Russian. They don't know Russian. They can't produce imperial histories in the sense that the previous generation still can, because they don't have Russian. I think that this is also a very specific kind of historically specific trajectory, which should be, the analysis of what is going on should be incorporated as you do in understanding the politics of science. But I would not really generalize from this one example. I really like this intervention by Rossen and the Marxism as a kind of a universal theory and its role. I have a few observations. I think that, jumping from pre-war to 80s and 90s postcolonial theory omits one important 1917 version of postcolonial theory, which is subaltern studies, the kind of explicit critique of Marxism and postcolonial theory from a kind of activist and Marxist, again, point of view. But basically why I'm mentioning this, because they addressed the non-Western peasant rationality as being absent in Marxism, and they found this in, Russian theories of, Chayanov, Kondratiev, and then they applied this as a kind of authentic body of knowledge to the case of Indian peasants. The genealogy of this theory, as we know now, thanks to works such as, say, by Ilya Gerasimov, is in Italian early 20th century agrarian movements. And so this is another wonderful example of this global conversation structured by power inequalities and reflection from within the Western paradigm about authenticity. So again, another example how this can be very productive when you kind of exercise this kind of translation and critique. I also have issues with, I mean, on the one hand, I agree with your comment on postcolonial theories that privileges discourse over a material reality. But on the other hand, this was postcolonial theories that posited body, physical body, as a source of language, right? It's also maybe should be a little bit nuanced, about maybe more nuances should be introduced. Very interesting example with Barnell's book and blackness of Greek culture and how this may be interpreted as is a Western colonization of science, because it's also articulated from Western kind of reality, right? Or like an authentic kind of science. But Du Bois basically did it. I mean, Du Bois had, he delivered a talk at the convention of archaeologists and sciences in the 20s in the US. And he basically advanced this notion, which was rooted in the early 20th century moment of reinventing Mediterranean by marginal nationalism, by all the scholars from the margins, from Zionism, from Italy, DC, who inspired Du Bois and others. So this is explicitly another example of kind of an attempt to create an authentic language of science and an alternative theory from the marginal position in the language of, I would say, not Western science, but really globalized kind of modern language of science that included all these contradictions embedded in the very process of producing, of creating modern science and modern language. And my final comment about this indigenous science, and this is the term that Alexander used, which is very uncomfortable. And I remember maybe 5-6 years ago, a Russian language journal invited scholars to discuss this model of indigenous science versus Western science. And this was a discussion that I'm sure many participants of this discussion remember. I took part in this discussion, and my question was, why actually, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we didn't see the emergence of a new wave of postcolonial theory from, the former Soviet region, something that you would expect if you compare this to the moment of post-Second World War decolonization. And my answer then was that this is, well, I referred to Sergei Ushakin, post-Soviet postcoloniality, refusal to embrace any subjectivity, and nationalism as the most powerful paradigm that had been already discredited. So now I think it's another very interesting moment to revisit this question and see what kind of new theories will emerge from the region in the process of exchanging knowledge and theories, because right now what we see is really the claim of subjectivity from Ukraine, in Belarus, right? This is a really kind of a very interesting postcolonial moment when subjectivity is articulated and claimed. And so maybe this will also help us to rethink the entire problem of, the non-Western region generating its own theory. Thank you.
I think we're gonna use organizers' prerogatives, and Alexei wanted to ask a question, as far as I know.
Yeah, well, I have a small comment that it probably strikes me the most is the the question of practicality of the theory. So I mean, because in different speakers saying about practice, about empirical evidence for for confirming the theory, but in a quite specific way that theory is the highest form of practice, and it is always important to to have one eye on the practices if we want to talk about theory. And I think that it is. I'm not so sure how to put it in the context of postcolonial turn, but maybe it is another important turn, which was mentioned in Michael Gordin's abstract and with the book by Warren Dustin and Peter Gallis on objectivity, like the practical term when we talk about theory, but based on concrete practices that we can use to shape our theoretical frameworks. But my question was a little bit more general, and probably from the field of general epistemology or general philosophy of science. And I saw that, the same question Mikhail Anatolyevich Бойцов, he asked it in the chat, because it is the question of whether there is something like pure empirical material, and whether we can easily to exclude theory from when we're talking about material, about empirical evidence and so on. Because I believe that in philosophy it could be easily connected with the discussion about the second positivism, and whether it is whether it is possible to say at all that there is something material, something empirical, which could be even conceptualized without some this or that theoretical framework. So I believe that it is much more in epistemological sense, it is much more hard question, but it is possible, to distinguish between Western theory and Eastern material, because there are always theoretical something that is embodied in this material. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Does anyone want to react, to respond? Olga Bessmertnaya is raising her hand, so Olga, please.
Yes, it's more or less the same I was speaking about when I spoke about the necessity to frame and translate what we get from other contexts. When I spoke about global, together with Marina, global Western science, meaning both science and scholarship. But I have a question, perhaps to myself and to other participants and to Marina and Michael. How to distinguish between this framing and translating and entanglement of what we get from other corners of the world in this global science, and just turning it into empirical material which we then conceptualize. Was it clear enough what I said, or should I make it more clear?
Olga, if you can maybe reformulate, so I didn't...
Yes, I mean that, the terms we were speaking about global Western science are those of translation, entanglement, and mutual influences and circulation of ideas, right? But when we return to more traditional conceptions of Western science, pure Western science, how do we distinguish between these entanglement, circulation of ideas, and just a simple conceptualization in Western terms of imperial material, which we get from those other corners of the world? Is it just a difference in terms, in words, and not in the very processes? Or is it a real entanglement and, globalizing polycentric knowledge?
I don't know. Again, it's not like I have all the answers, and I often believe that asking questions is even more productive. But I'm wondering. I mean, if I understood you correct, so you wonder about how we describe what's happening within the Western science in terms of exchange and translation and appropriation of empirical material that is produced elsewhere. How is it differ from how we describe this
Yes,
in Western context? Is this the question?
because when we speak about this entanglement, the polycentric production of knowledge, this global Western science, yes, we see different influences and some contaminations of ideas, like in Eurocentrism, for example. But in fact, when we at least I myself and some other speakers accepted that we need a translation of those different frames of knowledge in one common and shared language. And if so, whether it's not just a general, usual work with some empirical material which we conceptualize and reframe in Western terms.
I guess my answer is, at least, you know, how I see the problem is that, you know, the very notion of what is Western science is kind of open to me, at least, because, you know, my point is that modernity is a global phenomenon. It's being produced as a result of global entanglements and contexts and interaction and silencing and conflicts. And that's why Western science is also, it's a construct. It's basically a field of contestation and dialogue and constant, well, you said contamination, but basically it's a process. It's not something stable. It's not something explicitly bounded externally unless we accept such a model and we believe that this is so. And as far as I see this, I don't know whether, you know, nowadays, especially in sciences, you may say that, you know, China is outside of the world of Western science. So I'm not sure. I don't know. If you accept that this is a process, that the universal language, translation does not mean that we translate everything in one fixed language. This means that we operate with number of paradigms, with definitely, you know, there are some more fashionable, more powerful, and others less, but still we kind of operate with this paradigms. And I'm not even sure that, you know, direct translation or transfer is appropriate here. We all look into, you know, a mirror. So these are mirrors that are historically specific, that are in many ways local, that are kind of politically determined very often. So we look at these mirrors, we apply these universal paradigms and notions and concepts with different results. And this is how, you know, the process continues. And I wouldn't really overstress the uniformity of Western science. There are institutions that contribute to making this Western science uniform. There are political forces that make it more kind of uniformal. But I would not, as an ideal model at least, which I think is implied in the question, I would not imagine this as being something well stabilized and completely uniformed. And yeah, so this is probably how I would.
If I could add point to that. I agree that in general, it depends also when you're talking. In the last 30 years, an entity that you might call a more monolithic Western science is easier to discern because of changes in funding patterns, labor patterns. Conceptual frameworks have become more uniformized, made more uniform across the globe. But I don't think you could, in the 19th century, speak about a thing called Western science that has these clearer boundaries. And even today, it's still messy. I think that the place to pose this question most cleanly is in the case of Chinese science and medicine. Not traditional Chinese medicine, which is a category that was created in the 20th century. But in looking at what happens between the year 1000 and the year 1800 in Chinese space, I'm not a specialist. And that's part of the problem, is that this is a place where there is a quite clear knowledge-making tradition that is globally connected, but globally connected differently from the tradition that's happening in medieval and early modern Europe, and does not think about things in the same way. And all of that work is happening in a language, classical Chinese, for which there are no native speakers. Like this is in itself a language which we have to translate from into modern Chinese or English or Japanese or Russian. And the concepts are extremely difficult to translate into contemporary scientific terms in many cases. And so the problem that these scholars wrestle with is precisely this one of how can we use a stable linguistic or metaphysical or epistemological framework as a base to translate this extremely rich and robust and heterogeneous tradition that existed. And I think IGITI should bring in some specialists to talk about this problem, because I think it's a wonderful forum to address it. And I wish I knew more about it. But I think that's the place to look for. That is a place where this question is most actively debated. And there's a wide range of decisions. And I think this is related to much of what Andrej was talking about earlier, about changes of what's happened in archaeology are related to these questions of how you translate different themes into a framework that seems homogeneous. I hope that is clear. But I think that the first point about Western science, I do think there is something more uniform now than there was in 1950. And that in itself is something we need to keep in mind when we talk about Western science or Western knowledge, is that the entity is changing, but it's not always equal, just different. In some cases, it's more homogeneous, less diverse, less engaged, less accepting of global divergences than at other times. And maybe it will shift again post-pandemic.
I was wondering whether we can interrogate the specific status of the different disciplines within postcolonial studies, because it seems to me that their respective positions are vastly different and going in different trajectories. And I was, really struck especially by some of Michael's comments initially, which seem to suggest that in the history of science, postcolonial theory is still a high theory. Because it seems to me that in my very provincial neck of the woods, in literary scholarship, the age of high postcolonial theory has passed, and now most scholars working under that rubric are producing some very empirical studies, much of which has to do with the transition to a world literature paradigm, which has replaced a certain set of French theory authors with another set of primarily Anglophone scholars working on much more specific geographical, historical scenarios. But I'm just wondering whether in your disciplines you're seeing a similar turn to the empirical, or is it because literary studies was at the foundation of the origins of the post-colonial turn that now this the theoretical part of it has been much more exhausted than it seems elsewhere.
I think history of science is also a slow discipline to adopt theories. So I think you're right, we're behind. That's part of the reason why I can say in the 21st century this is happening, because it happened everywhere else much earlier. As to these other topics, I believe this is what Galin Tikhanov's one of his main themes from what's happening later, but I don't want to make him speak before he's ready to do so.
I think Galin Tikhanov wants to say something, but you're muted.
Okay. Well, yes, in a sense, it is true that post-colonial theory, itself has receded a little bit into the background, but the reason for that is not as much the growth of particular empirical studies, although this is also true. In my view, the reason is this realization that when you look at the way cultural history has evolved, you notice that certain very important developments have actually taken place without Western mediation. For example, the globalization of Buddhism. It's a journey from India to China, which occurs without Western mediation, but has very serious consequences for cultural history over a huge stretch of the globe. And when this realization built up empirical evidence to support this statement that not every crucial turn in cultural history has taken place with Western mediation, it is then that this other paradigm, I think, began to emerge as particularly important. This look at the global South and of cultural exchanges and ways to actually begin to make sense of these exchanges in areas of the world that would not actually necessitate a conceptualization through a Western prism. So the global South is an important perspective today, precisely because of all this. So yes, I do agree with that. As for world literature, the problem with world literature, in a sense, is that it continues, in a sense, in the footsteps of classic literary theory, but it conceals its premises. It is a liberal discourse in many ways, and as most liberal discourses, it is not interested in examining its own premises and reflecting on them. But that's my subjective, probably, and very limited take on all this. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I would just like to make 3 points here, maybe a little bit general, but I think they are relevant and important in the context of this discussion. Forgive me for reading them out to you, because it's just faster this way. So first, indeed, what is theory in the end, or theoretical analysis? What counts as theory? It's ways of conceptualizing the world, isn't it? Not just describing it, but ways of thinking about the world conveyed or communicated through a specific language, both natural and scientific. And thinking is done by people, and as such, thinking, including in our case, theoretical thinking, theory, is always and inescapably grounded in specific social cultural contexts. In the second half of the 20th century, sociologists argued this point very well, that there is no such thing as pure scientific knowledge. It is a product of the social and the cultural. I do not focus on the distinction between the social and the cultural here now, so I refer to both. Theory or any analytical language is indeed never neutral or objective and cannot be so. It can be abstract to an extent, So to an extent that it reflects little or nothing at all, it's a hard question. Indeed. And the growing fragmentation of the theoretical terrain that we observe now, this crumbling of theory, is a nationalization of theory, but as a natural development to deal with. And think about not theory, not even theory with the small letter T as a relevant term here, but theorizing, rather, theorizing about the world from within specific contexts. So theorizing instead of theory, the term that has been already around for some time. That's the first point. I'll try to be as brief as I can. So my second point is this, this development of knowledge research in and of itself does not have to automatically mean for us as researchers, wherever we come from, that Western theory is no longer relevant. Western, I mean, it has been productive indeed in many ways in making us think about the world in different ways. And a good point in this regard that one should not throw the baby with the bathwater can be found, for example, in the book entitled, edited by Audrey Simpson of Columbia University and Andrea Smith of University of California, Riverside, published in 2014. The book is titled Theorizing Native Studies, where in the introduction, I believe, they suggest how native studies can actually benefit from what has been done within Western theory to develop their own ways of theoretical thinking and what could be rethought. So no need to think in terms of Western, non-Western, just taking ideas that work for specific contexts on board without labeling them in any way. And my third point, or rather question, is thus this. Given this developing fragmentation and disassembling of theory, and the urge sometimes, really the urge that many researchers today feel to move away from theory at all, or try to build theory from elsewhere, as Michael suggested, what new ways of theoretical thinking could be possible in specific contexts? That is one part of the question. Or on what grounds a theoretical dialogue, or rather polylogue, I believe, would be possible to have them between them. So maybe it could be productive to start thinking not in terms of the dialectic of global versus local, globalization versus anti-globalization, or other terms that are often more politically rather than analytically charged, binary terms indeed, but in terms of looking for points of crossover. And this is the hard part, really. And indeed, the issue of translation, and again, on what grounds can we have such a theoretical dialogue, then becomes one of the topical ones, I believe. Thank you.
I wanted to back up to maybe a bit, to go back to what Marina said about the Western Academy and how it's more of a construct that we can populate with different ideas and possibly different people. And I'd like to maybe contest this idea a bit. I just finished, with me and my colleagues, we organized a conference on post-socialist memory studies. And as you can imagine, a lot of people doing post-socialist memory studies are exactly from these post-socialist countries. And a question that was very practical for us was, of course, the question of language. The conference was in English, and it was the sole language of the conference. But during our discussions, we sort of came to the idea that language is a privilege in academia, right? And Western academia can be described very easily through language. It is English speaking, specifically English writing and American English writing academia. And a lot of interesting scholars working on post-socialist memories and creating theories, maybe not big theories, but mid-level theories or specific conceptualization, the bricks of any discipline. If they write in a language other than English, their work is ignored. And then someone else writes something very similar in English, and this scholar is cited everywhere. We as a group, we actually discussed that, and we cannot find a solution for that, even though for us it is, as I said, a very practical problem of of reading each other and making our colleagues aware of work done in other languages other than English. But for now, it seems that it's sort of an unsolvable problem, and which basically means that if any scholar does not have a good writing English, this scholar is provincialized automatically.
I obviously agree with this point. I've spent a lot of time researching this point. It's much stronger in the natural sciences than even in the social sciences and humanities. It happened earlier and it happened more completely. In that in France, you still have an active Francophone community of theoretical work. You do not have an active Francophone community of natural scientists. It does not exist. So it's a serious problem. And it gets to Yelena's question, I think, of what could be another form of theory that doesn't have these roots. And I honestly don't know. And I don't know how we would find out about it. So even if it came up, how would we learn about it without it being already mediated, both metaphorically and linguistically, into a box that we now understand and communicated through English? I mean, there are many alternatives have been suggested over time. They have not manifested. And in the case of post-socialist memory studies, the obvious common language one could use would be Russian, which would be difficult politically and emotionally for a lot of people as well. And this is the same reason why the Bandung conference in the mid-50s functioned in English, even though most of the people there were former British colonials wanting to get away from that framework. It was the only choice they had, despite its political and emotional problems. I don't have a good answer to this question. It is a central question.
Add to what Michael said, and he definitely had written on this topic in historical perspective and contemporary ones. And I'm a practitioner here because I am a co-editor, co-founder of the journal that is a bilingual journal, right? So Ab Imperio is a bilingual journal. And we also accept contributions. We started accepting contributions in 5 languages. And it's very challenging and very difficult, but also when you kind of have this kind of protocol, which does make sense for the students of, former imperial world, simply because it's an entangled space. And, we accept works in Ukrainian and we translate and publish them either in English or in Russian. But I also have to say that Ukrainians actually prefer and find it possible to publish in Ab Imperio in Russian precisely because they do not perceive the space itself as being colonial, because we do reflect on the, linguistic politics. And this changes the equation. And I imagine that in the framework of your conference, speaking Russian would be not as problematic for many scholars from the former Soviet world, because you also do reflect on this problem. And this is precisely, I think, what we've been discussing, including all the understanding of complexity and power relations into the categories that we use and also in the policies that we apply. So this is not probably an ideal solution, but I do believe that if you work on the history, sociology, culture of the Russian Empire and the Soviet world and the post-Soviet transition, then Russian should be one of your languages. And so either English or Russian, I mean, the proficiency, of course, can vary, but this is a norm. And so this should be a conscious choice, a conscious position, but it also should be a position that is backed strongly by the domestic academic community that functions as a corporation that has a rigorous peer review process, maybe something like a professional association that really invests into this building of an identity based on language and a particular I wouldn't say theory, but probably vision of how modern science should be constructed. And this I find the most problematic part for many reasons, and we all know why. but in general, I think, you know, this is a very valid problem, and there are some solutions, like, you know, the one that I can present was urban period.
Yeah, yes, thank you. I think that's a very good point. I would add that we're sort of post-socialist, but not post-Soviet. So, you know, an Italian colleague working on Czech memory, she's sort of out both English and Russian. So, but that's besides the point. I really would love us to have some sort of break before the second session. So if our presenters and if our discussants want to make some final remarks, this would be the best time for it.
I just want to thank everyone for an extremely interesting conversation that extended much more broadly than the narrow confines in which I started. And that's the best form of a conference, and a good, I hope, an auspicious start for the conversations that follow.
Well, basically, I also want to say thank you so much for very inspiring discussion. And this is also the beginning of my day, and I have, you know, my first meeting starting at 11 a.m. So I will have to disappear also earlier, but thank you so much. And I hope, you know, that this format will allow us to meet again.